Hi, welcome to this FI-WARE course. My name is Javier Cerviño. I am working at the Technical University of Madrid as one of the FI-WARE developers. In this course, you will learn to use FI-WARE account to create users, organizations, and register your applications. You will also learn how to authenticate users in your web apps with their credentials on FI-WARE using the second version of the OAuth standard, so that your users will securely access their resources thanks to the authorization management developed in FI-WARE. This course is divided into 6 classes. The first one is a theoretical introduction of what FI-WARE account is and other components are, what protocols they use, and what you can do with them. The rest of the classes are demos that you can repeat to understand better how to extend your applications to authenticate users in FI-WARE. In the second class, for example, we will learn to use FI-WARE account to register users, to create organizations, to manage roles of these users into these organizations, and so on. In the third one, we will show you how to modify an existing web application to authenticate your users with their username and password in FI-WARE account. Then we will do the same from non-web applications. We can call them, for example, native applications, using the same standard and the same components. In class number 5, we will also change the backend of our application to secure requests to our APIs. Doing so, only apps used by the authenticated users will be able to make requests to our service. And finally, we will authorize also the access to our resources, using the roles in FI-WARE account to define who is allowed to access to resources that are more restricted. So, to introduce FI-WARE account, I will show you a similar product. I bet you all have used Gmail at some point, and probably you also own an account. Most of you have used Google Drive, also known as Google Docs, or Google Calendar, or so on. From my experience, there are not so many people that knows what Google account is. It's a service that you use every time you authenticate in a meeting in Google Calendar or in any Google service. When you connect to your Gmail account or edit a document in Google Drive, these services redirect you to Google account, and you will put there your credentials if you weren't authenticated yet. So in FI-WARE, we are using the same mechanism, introducing FI-WARE account. There are already a lot of applications that are using this component to authenticate their users. Probably some of you have already used the Cloud Portal, WARE Cloud Store, the Context Broker, and so on. In that case, you have already registered in FI-WARE account. But there are apps outside FI-WARE that are also using it to authenticate users and act as generic enablers. In this course, we will learn how to create these applications. Basically, FI-WARE account is a service to manage users, authenticate and authorize them, and manage organizations. The resources we can manage are users, which represent people in the real world, organizations that are a group of users, and roles that represent a set of permissions of users in their organizations. Finally, there are applications that are third-party services that want to access protected resources that belong to the users. Typically, users register themselves in this service, they create their organizations, and they assign roles to other users in these organizations. FI-WARE account is the first door that offers applications to access users' protected information. This information can be stored in the same FI-WARE account, such as, for example, the email, the username, the date of birth, and so on, or in other generic enablers as well. This access is handled in a trusted environment using the OAuth 2.0 standard. This is a widely used standard and there are plenty of libraries and different programming languages that are full compliant with it. In this URL, you can find many of these libraries. Now we'll see how this standard works and what is it is used nowadays. OAuth 2.0 is widely used by many well-known services in the internet. For example, Facebook, Google, Twitter, GitHub, LinkedIn, all of them are using OAuth as OAuth providers. And there are also a lot of applications that are OAuth clients that allow us to authenticate using our accounts in these services, in Facebook, in Twitter, and so on. Now, FI-WARE is another OAuth provider that you can use to authenticate your users. OAuth 2.0 proposes a mechanism to provide applications access to protected resources without sharing users' credentials. To do so, applications use access tokens issued by OAuth providers to access these resources, because these access tokens represent the user. OAuth 2.0 is designed to be used with HTTP requests, and there are 4 different players. The resource owner, which typically is the user who wants to grant access to a protected resource. The resource server is the place where the resource is hosted. The client is the application that accesses the protected resource on behalf of the resource owner using these access tokens. And the authorization server is the service that issues access tokens to the clients. OAuth 2.0 can be used in 4 different scenarios. These scenarios imply different messages to exchange the access token, and they depend on the nature of the client that requests this access token. I will explain you the architecture of these scenarios in FI-WARE. The first one is the authorization code grant. This scenario is the most representative in the second version of OAuth. In this case, a user grants an OAuth provider, typically a web application, access to his protected resources using an OAuth provider. The OAuth consumer has to be previously registered in the OAuth provider to establish a trust relationship between them. To grant the access, the client first redirects the user web browser to the OAuth provider. There, the user authenticates and tells the provider to allow the consumer to access his resources. The provider sends a response code to the user's browser if he authenticates and redirects his browser back to the OAuth consumer, which retrieves this response code. It will use this response code in the credentials obtained when the consumer registers in the provider, and if these credentials are right, then the OAuth provider will generate the access token and it will send it to the OAuth consumer. From this point, the consumer will be able to access users' resources in the server resource using the access token. The second scenario is the implicit grant. This scenario differs from the previous one, in which the OAuth consumer doesn't implement a programmatic logic at the backend. We can think of it as an Apache running static HTML pages. In this case, all the logic of the client runs in the user's web browser, like for example a JavaScript application. And in this case, the first 3 steps represent the same browser redirection we saw in the previous scenario. But then, during user authentication, in the OAuth provider, the browser will send also the consumer identifier. With this info, the provider will generate directly the access token and it will issue it to the user's browser. The difference is that the previous scenario, it generated a response code that was later used by the consumer to retrieve the final access token. Now, the access token is directly generated in this step, and the web browser will send it to the OAuth consumer through the second redirection. At this point, then, the OAuth consumer will use it to access restricted resources of the user. So, the next scenario is the resource owner password credentials grant. Its main difference is that the user doesn't use a web browser to access the OAuth consumer. So it will send his credentials in FI-WARE to the OAuth consumer. In this case, the user should trust the OAuth consumer because it will use his private credentials to retrieve the access token. Once obtained from the OAuth provider, it will use the access token as usual. Okay, this scenario is called the client credentials grant because there are no users. Here, the OAuth consumer will authenticate itself to access its own resources at the resource owner. So in this case, once its own credentials are sent to the OAuth provider, it will answer with the access token, and then the OAuth consumer will use it to access its resources. Okay, so once our application, which is an OAuth consumer, obtains this access token, there are different types of resources we can access on behalf of the user in FI-WARE. Let's see what we can do with it. The first thing we would like to do is to access information about the user, such as the email, the username, and so on. We'll do it by making this request to the FI-WARE account, which is the OAuth provider. And in the URL, we should put the access token we obtained during OAuth negotiation. We'll also access different generic enablers, such as the context broker, by using access token in an authorization HTTP header. This is how OAuth standard specifies to send this access token. But we are also able to access other resources providers that are using FI-WARE or deploy our own APIs that take the most of this component. To do so, there is an open source tool that you can use to secure your APIs that is called the PEP proxy. This tool is a proxy that will redirect only those requests that bring a valid access token in the authorization header. It will validate these tokens against the FI-WARE account. In the case of the cloud generic enablers, we follow a different authentication mechanism. In this case, we'll need what we call a scoped token to access users' cloud resources. This scoped token is related only to an organization which the user belongs to. So, first, we need to obtain a list of organizations of the user by making the first request. This is the same step we use to access private user information, and we obtain it from FI-WARE account. Then our application will decide which organization it will use, and it will send this organization together with the access token within the scope token request. This request is sent to the Keystone Project component, which will generate a scoped token if the access token is valid and if the user has access to this organization. Then, once we have the scope token, we will be able to access users' cloud resources with it. For example, we can make requests to obtain virtual machines of the user in that organization, or access the files the user is storing in the cloud, and so on. To do so, we need to use the corresponding APIs of these services. I encourage you to do the corresponding courses in the FI-WARE e-learning platform. Okay, to summarize, we've seen what FI-WARE account is, how you can use it to create your identity in FI-WARE, and how your applications can take advantage of it to authenticate FI-WARE users and access their restricted resources. If you want to learn more about FI-WARE account, you can see the related documentation in the slide, and I put here also the OAuth specification in FI-WARE account. And you can also download the FI-WARE PEP proxy to secure your own APIs. So, in the next classes, we'll see a demonstration of the use of FI-WARE account and how we can adapt our applications to this environment. To do so, we will play the role of a geek blogger, which wants other users to read his posts through FI-WARE. So, first, he will register in FI-WARE, he will see that there are no organizations related with blogs, and he will create a new one, where he will invite other geeks. we'll see how users that are not logged in FI-WARE will not be able to access the blog, while those who are logged in will see the posts. And finally, we'll also see how to give special permissions to some users that will be able to write posts in the blog, while other gig users will only be able to view their posts. So, thank you for attending this class. On the next one, we will start using FI-WARE account to create users, organizations, and so on. Bye!